A lifeless body lies hidden where no patron dares to look. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I'm your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where are you joining us from tonight? Your voices bring these mysteries alive. Let's begin. The first drops of rain had begun before Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres that evening, a fine, steady drizzle that blurred the lamps along the Seine and spread a faint sheen across the black pavement. He turned up the collar of his heavy overcoat and walked without hurry, his broad frame steady against the damp. The night smelled faintly of wet stone and roasting chestnuts from a vendor huddled beneath an awning. Maigret paused long enough to buy a small bag, more for the warmth in his pocket than the taste, before continuing toward Boulevard Saint-Michel, where Madame Maigret waited with a late dinner. There was comfort in such evenings. The city folding into its grey dampness, the people moving quickly past without meeting his eye, the thought of his wife's quiet smile when he entered the apartment. He liked these stretches of solitude, when the work-day was officially over, yet the weight of other people's lives still clung faintly to him. Cases, quarrels, half-told confessions. They did not end when he signed the papers. They lingered, like the rain, thin and patient. Near the corner of Rue Soufflot, he stopped beneath the awning of a small café he knew well, the kind where students lingered over cheap wine and clerks came to read their papers alone. The windows were fogged, the yellow light within muted by the streaks of rain. He had not intended to stop, but some impulse made him push the door open. A gust of warmth and smoke brushed over him as he entered. The place was nearly empty. A waiter, young and thin, with hair plastered flat from the damp, nodded and wiped his hands on a towel. Two students murmured at a corner table, their notebooks open between coffee cups. At the rear, a large table sat oddly abandoned, its chairs pushed back unevenly, the check not yet collected. There was nothing unusual in it, and yet Maigret's eyes lingered. Something in the careless disorder, one glass turned neatly upside down, another smudged with hurried fingerprints, struck him with the faintest unease. He ordered a beer and settled near the window. The glass steamed against his hand, and he watched the rain without really seeing it. The voices from the corner drifted toward him, low and unimportant. But his attention returned again and again to that empty rear table. It was not suspicion yet, only a tug in his mind, the way a certain smell in the street could remind one of a childhood kitchen, an echo of something not quite right. The waiter approached timidly. "You'll stay long, Inspector?" he asked, lowering his voice, as though reluctant to disturb the quiet. He knew Maigret by sight, as many in this quarter did. "Only a little," Maigret said, and sipped slowly. "Why?" The young man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the rear table. "It's nothing. Only the man who sat there. He left without paying, but that happens. Students sometimes, or men after too much wine." "Did he seem a student?" Maigret asked. The waiter shook his head. "Number, not a student." He frowned as though replaying the details in his mind. "Older, a coat too fine for here. He sat a long while, just looking into his glass. Then he left. I thought he was coming back, but he didn't." Maigret did not press. He only nodded and let the silence stretch, the boy shifting under it until he excused himself and returned to his cloth. The rain thickened outside, drumming lightly against the window panes. The warmth of the beer spread through Maigret's chest, yet that rear table pulled at him still, stubborn as a pebble in one's shoe. When he finally rose to go, his coat heavy again with dampness, he passed close enough to glance at the table. A dark stain lingered near the edge, spreading into the grain of the wood. Wine, perhaps, but not the color of the thin Beaujolais most ordered here. He stood a moment longer than he meant to, then pulled his collar higher and stepped into the night. By the time he reached home, Madame Maigret had set the soup on the table. He kissed her cheek, hung his coat, and said nothing of the café. But later, when she asked absently about his day, he found himself remembering the smudged glass, the stain on the wood, and the man in the fine coat who had not returned. It was nothing yet, nothing official. But Maigret had learned to trust these moments, the quiet pricks of unease that came not from evidence, but from silence and presence. The rain outside tapped on the shutters, steady, insistent, as though reminding him that the night's work was not quite finished. The next morning broke grey and sullen, the rain not quite stopped, but lingering in a mist that clung to the facades of the buildings and left the pavements slick. Maigret stood a moment at his window with his pipe, watching the street slowly stir into its morning rhythm. Horses clopped past pulling delivery carts, their hooves softened by the damp, and shopkeepers dragged out awnings, muttering as they shook the water from them. Madame Maigret moved quietly behind him, laying out coffee and rolls. He accepted his cup with a nod and a faint smile, though his mind was elsewhere. He had slept well enough, but the image of that abandoned rear table, the careless smudge of fingerprints and the dark stain on the wood, had risen more than once in the darkness. It was nothing, he told himself. Or rather, nothing yet. But he was already certain that his feet would lead him back to that café before the day grew much older. By 9, he was walking again along the Seine, coat collar turned up, pipe snug between his teeth. The mist pressed against his face like a cold cloth, and the water of the river looked thick and sluggish under the pale light. He did not hurry. His bulk moved steadily, as though he had all the time in the world, but beneath his heavy gait was the quiet current of purpose. At the corner of Rue Soufflot, the café waited with its windows still fogged, as though the night had not entirely left it. A milk cart stood nearby, and the driver called a greeting as he heaved crates through the side door. Inside, the air was already alive with the clatter of crockery and the smell of damp wool coats steaming by the stove. The young waiter from the night before looked up sharply when Maigret entered, his eyes betraying a flicker of both recognition and relief. He wiped his hands hastily on his apron and came forward. "Inspector, you're back." His voice was low, nervous, though no one else in the room seemed to notice. A handful of customers lingered over their breakfast, reading newspapers or dipping bread into bowls of café au lait. Ordinary enough. But Maigret's eyes went unerringly to the rear, where the table remained unoccupied. The stain, darker now against the dry wood, spread like a shadow. "Something wrong?" Maigret asked softly, not taking off his coat yet. He let his gaze remain on the table, though he did not move toward it. The young man swallowed and nodded quickly. "The owner found him this morning. I didn't see it myself, but perhaps you should." His words trailed off, as though afraid of being overheard. Maigret motioned with a finger for him to calm down and took a slow step toward the back. The murmurs of the café dimmed in his ears, though in truth no one had stopped their eating. A simple corner, a simple table, yet the weight of silence seemed thicker there. 2 chairs were pulled close, one slightly askew as if someone had tried to rise in a hurry. On the seat, a folded napkin, and beneath the table, Maigret saw it, the edge of a shoe protruding black leather dulled by dampness. For a long moment he did not speak. He drew his pipe from his mouth and tapped it gently against his palm, a habit when his thoughts ran deep. "Call the local commissariat," he said at last, his voice steady but carrying enough weight that the waiter immediately obeyed. He did not raise his tone, nor rush forward as some might have expected. Instead, he stood still, allowing the room to settle around the knowledge of what lay hidden in its shadows. Slowly, he bent his broad frame and peered beneath the table. The body was half-curled against the wall, as if trying to retreat into the plaster. The coat, indeed of fine quality, was dark wool, now crumpled and smeared with dust. The man's face was turned slightly away, but Maigret could see the slack pallor of death. His hat lay nearby, crushed between chair and wall. He straightened with a quiet sigh, his gaze roaming across the room. None of the customers had fled. Most had not even looked up, though he sensed that each was listening in their own guarded way. The ordinariness of their movements, butter spread, cups lifted, pages turned, struck him more deeply than any outcry could have. The dead man was already absorbed into the cafe's routine, just another thing to be endured before noon. When the uniformed officers arrived, led by a stout sergeant with red cheeks from the cold, Maigret stepped back enough to let them through. The sergeant blustered a little, surprised to see the inspector himself there so early, and began to bark orders. But Maigret's presence softened the edges of the scene. He directed no one sharply, only suggested with small nods. Cover the body, clear the nearby tables, speak softly so as not to startle the others. His calm was contagious, and soon the café settled again, the clatter of cups mixing with the quiet shuffle of police shoes. The owner appeared, a broad-shouldered man in a stained waistcoat, his hair sticking damply to his forehead. He wrung his hands, muttering that he had opened as usual, had gone to wipe down the tables, and had nearly stumbled on the body. "But he was here last night, wasn't he?" Maigret said, more a statement than a question. The man hesitated, glanced at the waiter, and gave a short nod. "Yes, he sat alone, ordered wine. I thought nothing of it." "And when he left?" "I thought he left," the owner admitted, lowering his voice. "But perhaps. He only moved to the back. I can't be sure. You know how it is, Inspector. We see so many faces. They blur together." His nervous laugh fell flat. Maigret studied him for a moment, then let his eyes return to the customers. The students from the night before were absent, replaced now by clerks in stiff collars and a pair of older women sharing whispered conversation. No one seemed unduly disturbed. Life continued, yet beneath it all, the weight of the rear table remained. A man had died here, unnoticed in the heart of the ordinary. The body was lifted carefully and taken away. No identification had been found on him. No papers, no wallet, nothing beyond the fine coat and the well-made shoes. That detail troubled Maigret more than the death itself. A man of such appearance did not simply forget his papers. If they were absent, they had been removed. And removed meant someone else's hand had lingered after his last breath. Outside, the mist thickened into drizzle once more. Maigret stood beneath the café's awning as the stretcher was carried into the waiting van. He lit his pipe slowly, his wide face expressionless, but his eyes heavy with thought. The waiter hovered near him, shifting from foot to foot. "Inspector," he whispered, "do you think it was murder?" Maigret exhaled a stream of smoke, watching it curl into the damp air. "What else would you call it?" he murmured, not as a question but as an acknowledgement of what they both already knew. He asked for the boy's name, Julian, and patted his arm briefly before turning away. As he walked back along the street, the bells of a distant church marked the hour. The city bustled as always, carts rattling, umbrellas bobbing, the steam of soup rising from market stalls. Yet for Maigret, the day had taken on a different hue. Not dramatic, not urgent, but heavy, inevitable. A man in a fine coat had died quietly in a corner, and no one had asked why. Now it was his burden to wait, to watch, and to let the truth drift toward him like the rain seeping into the stones. By the time he reached the office at the Quai des Orfèvres, his coat dripping steadily on the floor, he had already decided he would return to the café again that evening. Not with a warrant or a parade of officers, but with his own silent wait. He would sit at a corner table, order a beer, and watch. Somewhere among those who passed in and out, who sipped their coffee and glanced at the rear table with too much or too little interest, the silence would break. It always did. He did not make a show of it at the office. He hung his wet coat on the same peg, nodded to the typist who was always too cold, and listened without impatience while a deputy public prosecutor recited phrases about procedure and jurisdiction. The routine moved around him like furniture being shifted in a familiar room. Lucas came in with his hat still beaded with rain, and Janvier followed carrying the first thin report from the commissariat in the quarter. Unknown male, 50 to 60, robust build, no identity papers, no obvious wounds except a bruise behind the right ear. Wallet absent, ring finger pale where a band had once been. Robbery? Lucas suggested, though not with conviction. Maigret rolled his pipe between his fingers and grunted softly, which could mean anything. He walked down to the morgue alone. The drizzle had turned to a mean, steady rain, the kind that does not look like much but soaks into everything. In the tiled quiet below, faces waited under glass. The man from the café lay with his jaw slightly fallen, the lines about the mouth drooping in a way that suggested resignation more than surprise. The fine coat had been taken to a shelf nearby. Maigret ran his fingers over the cloth, feeling the quality without looking as though he cared. The right inside pocket was smooth with the memory of a wallet. The left sleeve had a button sewn with a thread a shade lighter than the cloth, the knot hard and a little clumsy, as though the repair had been done in bad light or by someone unused to mending. He smelled faintly not of the cheap hair oil many men used, but of a discreet cologne that clung to the collar. On the man's left hand, the skin where a ring had been was not entirely pale, a faint outline, recent. If removed, it had been taken not long before death. He stood a long moment looking at the face. It did not have the loose softness of a habitual drinker's. The lips were thin, the nostrils narrow. A clerk, perhaps, or a small shop proprietor. Someone who took care with his shoes and had them cleaned even on days like this. At the thought, he felt again the heaviness of the rear table and the smudged glass. He tapped his pipe lightly against his palm and went back up into the rain. At the café, the lunch hour passed with the usual murmur. Steam fogged the windows again, and coats hung heavily along the wall by the stove. The rear table was empty, of course. A cloth had been draped over it after the morning's disturbance, but the shape of the table showed through like a covered monument. He took a seat near the middle this time, where he could be seen without being conspicuous. The owner, Perrin, he had learned the name from the report, approached with the stiff, uneasy politeness of a man who would like to be helpful and would also like the police to disappear. "You will take something, Inspector?" "A beer, thank you." He let the man stand a moment. "You open at 6? "1:30, Perrin said. He smoothed his apron reflexively. "With the milk and the newspapers." "You closed?" "Midnight, a little after." A quick look toward the rear table. "Last night was quiet. Students mostly." The man in the fine coat, he arrived when? Perrin hesitated, as if trying to conjure the figure out of the steam of memory. "Before 10, perhaps 1:45. He asked for wine. He drank little." "And he left?" "I thought he had left." "Julian said," he called across the room. "Julian!" The young waiter came at once, towel in hand, his hair no longer plastered but still shining from the damp. He looked younger in daylight, the skin along his jaw dotted where shaving had gone hurriedly. "Inspector, you told me last night that he went without paying." Julian's eyes flickered. Not a lie. Not yet. Only the small panic that comes when asked to repeat a story one would prefer to forget. "I was sure he stood, Inspector. He stood, and he took his hat. I thought he was going toward the door. I had 2 tables then, the students asking for more bread. When I turned back, the chair was empty." "And the check?" "I had not written it yet," he said, flushing slightly. "He had only 1 glass. Sometimes we make the note after. It was not a busy night." Maigret nodded as though such things were known to him, which they were. He let the pause lengthen. Perrin shifted, looked toward the stove. One of the older women at the window glanced over quickly and then fixed her gaze on the street with exaggerated interest. "You found the body this morning," Maigret said to Perrin. "As I told the sergeant." His hands tightened on the towel. I came to wipe the tables. The cloth caught on a shoe. He swallowed. I am not squeamish, Inspector, but the side door, Maigret said mildly. You use it early? For the milk. The boy leaves the crates there. A small nod toward the hallway, where one could see only a recess of shadow and a scuffed strip of linoleum. We keep it bolted at night. It was bolted this morning? Perrin hesitated too long. I believe so. Believe? Last night I closed as usual. The rain. One forgets small things when one is damp. Or when one is distracted, Maigret said. He turned to Julian again. You said the man took his hat. I saw him hold it. He looked at the door, as if expecting. I thought perhaps he was waiting for someone. Did anyone come to him? Julian opened his mouth and closed it. His fingers worried the edge of the towel. A woman stood at the door at 10, he said finally, blurting it as if confessing to a childish theft. She did not enter. She had a red umbrella with a wooden handle. Very red. It made a stain in the glass. He gestured toward the window, embarrassed by the imprecision of his words. She looked toward the back. I went to ask if she wanted something. She said no and moved on. Did you tell the sergeant this? They did not ask, he said, the defensiveness of youth edging his voice. They asked for the name of the wine and where I kept the cloth. Perrin made a small sound of protest that was not quite a sound. Maigret let it pass. He stood and walked without haste toward the rear table. The cloth lay smooth now, but he lifted the corner and looked at the wood. The dark stain had dried to a dull brown, irregular along the edge. He touched it with a forefinger and brought it to his nose. He did not need to. The smell was already in the room, faint under the coffee and damp wool. Not Beaujolais. On the table, someone had set the glasses neatly aside. One of them, he could not have said why he knew which, had been turned rim down last night. Now it sat upright with the others. He took it gently between his fingers and tilted it toward the light. There was a smudge along the rim, not the gray of ash, but the pale dust of face powder, barely there. He turned it again, and the trace disappeared, as though it had never existed. He did not comment. He set the glass down and looked at the chairs. One scraped unevenly, as though pushed back by a knee rather than a hand. On the seat of another, the napkin that had been folded last night lay refolded, less precisely this time, as though someone had copied the gesture without caring whether it convinced. He tucked his pipe between his teeth and turned back. The two older women at the window were watching now and no longer pretending not to. He went to them as one goes to a neighbor one has known for many years and does not particularly like but relies upon. You come each morning? Most, one said. Her hair was the color of paper. Her lips were set in a line that would never be softened by any man's joke. We sit where the draft is least. You saw the man last night. We were not here last night, she said quickly. The other woman, younger by a year or two, nodded. But we saw a gentleman 2 evenings ago, she added with the small defiance of those who want their bit of importance. Also in a good coat. He spoke softly. Not to us, she added. To himself, perhaps. Or to the air, her friend sniffed. Men talk to the air when they are waiting for women. What time? Maigret asked without interest. Interest made people harden. The absence of it made them remember. 9:30, the younger said. He looked at his watch, the kind with a chain. So he had had a watch, and if a watch had been in that coat this morning, it had not been there in the morgue. He thanked them with a small tilt of his head and returned to his chair. When the beer came, he did not drink immediately. He let the glass sit, gauzy with condensation, as a clerk in a stiff collar at the counter fumbled with coins and muttered about shortages of sugar. Ordinary life moved around the empty table, flowed past it like water around a stone. Lucas arrived and settled without fuss opposite him, taking off his hat and tapping it dry with 2 fingers. No one reported missing in the night, he said. Not yet. The tailor shops in the quarter will remember the coat. Perhaps, Maigret said. A red umbrella. Lucas blinked. Pardon? A woman at the door at 10. She did not enter. She looked toward the back. Lucas's eyes went to the cloth-draped table and away again. The side door bolt. Perrin believes he bolted it. Maigret let the smoke from his pipe drift. Belief is a thin blanket. And the pockets? Hands tidy, he said. Someone removed what he was. Wallet, watch, ring. The man had been a husband not long before last night. Lucas frowned. How do you... Maigret's eyes moved to the glass he had turned in his hand, and then to Julien, who was folding cutlery near the stove with too much attention. Because he was expecting someone who powdered her face in a hurry, an hour too early, and then stood under a red umbrella without daring to enter, he said. Because he took little wine, because he did not look surprised. Lucas followed his gaze to the waiter, then to the owner, then to the window where the rain sketched lines over the street. Shall I bring the milk boy? In the afternoon, Maigret said. He will recall nothing and everything, and we will see which weighs more. He paid for the beer he had barely touched and stood. The damp from the floor had crept into the leather of his shoes, and he felt it at last. As he reached the door, he paused. Across the street, beyond the reflection of his own bulk in the glass, a woman passed under a red umbrella, perhaps not the same shade, perhaps not the same handle. She did not look in. She moved with the stilted care of someone trying not to be seen running. Maigret watched her until the corner swallowed the color, and then he went out into the rain that had never really stopped. The rain seemed to thicken as the afternoon drew on, as though the sky itself had grown tired of holding back. Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres slowly, his coat collar turned up and his pipe unlit between his teeth, the image of the red umbrella still flickering somewhere in the corner of his mind. He climbed the familiar worn stairs and found Janvier waiting with the first dry facts. No reports yet of a man missing who matched the body. No calls from worried families. No employers wondering at an absence. It was still early, of course. People tolerated absence for a day or two before alarm set in. Still, Maigret listened with a heavy silence that made Janvier shuffle his papers again, as though to assure himself they were not thinner than they looked. He sat behind his desk and lit his pipe at last, filling the office with the slow, comforting clouds of smoke. He was not in a hurry. The dead man had been in no hurry either, at least not outwardly. Death had arrived for him in silence, not in the rush of an alley fight or a drunken quarrel. A man who waits at a table, who drinks little wine, who holds his hat as though about to leave. Such a man expects something, or someone. The absence of papers, of the ring, of the watch, all pointed not only to murder, but to the deliberate removal of identity. Someone had wanted him to be no one at all, a bundle under a table to be carted off without name or story. And yet, Maigret thought, people are never no one. Even the most ordinary life leaves a residue. A glance, a memory in a neighbor, a seat taken every morning at a café. He blew out smoke. Patient. The residue would come. In the late afternoon, he returned to the quarter. The café had settled back into its rhythm, though the rear table was kept discreetly empty, as if the stain could spread by proximity. The waiter, Julien, gave him a nervous nod. Perrin, the owner, made a point of polishing the brass taps with unnecessary vigor. Maigret sat again, ordered nothing at first, simply letting his broad presence fill the corner. Outside, traffic splashed through the rain, umbrellas bobbed, and the evening pressed itself into the streets. After a time, he beckoned Julien with 2 fingers. The boy came quickly, drying his hands. The milk arrives at 6:30, Maigret asked. Julien nodded. Delivered by a boy from the dairy on Rue Monge, always the same boy. You know him? Henri. 15, perhaps 16. And this morning? Julien shifted slightly. He came as usual. I carried the crates in. The side door was bolted? I unbolted it, as always. He hesitated. It was bolted from inside. I turned it myself. Then someone must have left before you closed last night, Maigret said softly, more to himself than to Julia. And yet the man under the table did not leave. Curious. Julian flushed and opened his mouth, but Maigret raised a hand gently, ending the exchange. He knew better than to press too hard. The boy's nerves would tangle the truth in unnecessary invention. He let him go and turned his gaze once more toward the cloth-covered table. It was then that the two older women entered, the ones he had spoken with in the morning. They gave him sidelong looks as they passed, not hostile but wary, like cats noticing a dog in their territory. They took their usual seats by the window, ordering coffee in small voices. Maigret did not approach them. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch until their own need to speak overcame them. After some minutes, the younger of the two rose, approached his table, and leaned in just enough to be heard. "You asked about him? The gentleman?" "Yes." I remembered something. Her lips pressed together. "He wore gloves. Brown leather gloves. Not last night, another evening." He placed them on the table before him, neatly, side by side. "But when he left, I did not see him pick them up." She hesitated, then added, "We did not tell the sergeant. We thought it unimportant." "Everything is important," Maigret said quietly. "Thank you." She returned to her seat, her friend nodding vigorously as if to confirm the gift of memory. Maigret thought of the gloves, of the ringless hand. Objects removed, others forgotten. What remained was as telling as what was gone. Lucas arrived just as dusk began to fall, shaking rain from his hat. He brought a note of faint humor with him, as always, which seemed out of place against the damp air. "The coat," he said, sliding into the chair across from Maigret. "Taylor on Rue de Vaugirard remembers it. Sold 3 years ago to a man named Lachaume. Mid-level accountant for a shipping firm. Lachaume is married. His wife reported nothing yet." "An accountant," Maigret murmured. The word fit the face he had studied at the morgue. Precise, restrained, a man whose life followed columns and rows, a man with little wine, a man who might wait. "Shall we visit the wife?" Lucas asked. "In the morning," Maigret replied. "Tonight we will sit." And so they did. The café filled gradually as evening deepened. Clerks with tired faces, students with restless laughter, solitary men with newspapers folded under their arms. All ordinary, all unremarkable. Yet Maigret's eyes tracked each one, searching not for guilt, but for the small flicker of unease, the glance too carefully avoided toward the rear table. Once, a woman entered. Not young, not old, with a pale scarf pulled tightly under her chin. For an instant, Maigret thought of the red umbrella, of the powder trace on the glass. She paused just inside the door, looked around, and then left as quickly as she had come. No umbrella this time, only the silence of retreat. Lucas shifted, but Maigret shook his head. Not yet. When at last they rose, the café was still busy, life continuing its indifferent course around the absence in the corner. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist again. They walked side by side toward the Seine, their heavy shoes leaving prints on the slick pavement. "If it is Lachaume," Lucas said, "we will know soon enough. The firm will notice his absence. The wife will come." "She will," Maigret said. He drew on his pipe and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke mingle with the mist. But the umbrella has already come. And gone. Back in his apartment, Madame Maigret listened quietly as he recounted only part of the day, her hands folded on the table. She did not interrupt, only nodded from time to time. When he fell silent, she poured him another cup of coffee and said, almost absent-mindedly, "A woman who waits at a door rarely waits alone. Either she fears to enter, or she fears what she will find if she does." The words settled in him, as her offhand remarks often did, as though she had tapped a place he already knew but had not yet opened. He sat with them long after she had gone to bed, the rain ticking softly against the window until the shapes of the case began to take on their quiet inevitability. A man with a fine coat and no papers, a ringless hand, gloves forgotten or taken, a red umbrella that paused but did not enter. It was no longer only a corpse beneath a table. It was a story of two people intersecting, and of one who had been left behind in the shadows. The next morning would bring him to the Lachaume household. But tonight he let the silence deepen, certain that the residue of this man's life would not remain hidden much longer. The morning was sharper, the rain thinner but colder, slicing down in narrow lines that made the air seem stripped bare of warmth. Maigret walked with his pipe unlit, his hat pulled low, carrying with him the quiet gravity of the evening before. He had told Lucas they would call on Madame Lachaume first thing, and so they made their way to a modest street off Rue de Vaugirard, where accountants and clerks lived in apartments, not shabby, but not elegant either. Places where wallpaper yellowed slowly over decades and stairwells smelled of boiled cabbage. The concierge opened her door only halfway when they arrived, squinting at the inspector's card before nodding toward the third floor. Her eyes lingered on them, greedy for news but unwilling to ask directly. They climbed the stone stairs, damp from boots that had passed before, and knocked at the apartment. It was opened by a woman in her late 40s, pale from lack of sleep, her hair pinned without care. She wore a housecoat over her dress, the belt loosely tied, and she looked at them with the weary resignation of someone who had been expecting a visit like this without knowing when it would come. "Madame Lachaume," Maigret said, bowing slightly. "We must trouble you for a moment." She stepped aside, silent, and led them into a narrow sitting room where the curtains had been drawn against the grey light. The furniture was respectable but worn. A sofa with its cushions sagging, a sideboard bearing framed photographs of younger days, a heavy clock ticking with unnecessary emphasis. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and old smoke. She motioned them to sit, though she herself remained standing near the mantelpiece, her hand resting lightly on it as though for balance. "My husband?" she asked quietly, the two words almost a whisper. Maigret looked at her with the slow compassion he reserved for such moments. "Yes, he was found last night, at a café." He did not embellish. His eyes watched her face, not for drama, but for the small shifts of expression. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaled, and then nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. "I knew," she murmured. He had not come home. Had he failed to come home before? Her lips tightened. Not for years. Once, when he was younger, he stayed out late with friends from work, but never recently. He was punctual, always punctual. Lucas asked softly. "You reported nothing?" She shook her head. "This morning I was going to, but—" She trailed off and pressed her fingers to her temple. Maigret leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the silence breathe. "Your husband wore a wedding ring," he said finally. She looked at her hands, her face tightening. "Yes." "He was found without it." Her eyes flicked up, quick, sharp, but she said nothing. He continued, his tone even. "His papers, his watch, also missing." For a moment, she seemed to sway. Then she sat heavily on the sofa, her housecoat falling open at the knees. "Then it is true," she whispered. "Not an accident." "No," Maigret said gently. "Not an accident." Her hands trembled in her lap, twisting a handkerchief she had pulled from her sleeve. "He was a quiet man, Inspector. He had no enemies. He went from home to office. From office to home. We lived simply." Her voice wavered but did not break. "But lately, he had been different, distracted." "In what way?" "He went out in the evening sometimes, saying he would take a walk. He stayed longer at the office, or so he said. He was thoughtful." I would ask what weighed on him, and he would shake his head. She hesitated, lowering her eyes. I thought perhaps there was a woman. Maigret said nothing. The words had come with the rhythm of confession, and he knew they were truer for being reluctantly spoken. He let her sit with them, the clock ticking steadily behind her. He was careful with money, she added after a pause. Too careful sometimes. He would not have thrown anything away. If he had no papers, they were taken. If his ring is gone. She closed her eyes again. It was not him who removed it. Lucas scribbled quietly in his notebook, but Maigret only smoked and nodded. After a time he rose, thanked her with a gravity that needed no words, and said, "We will return, madame. Perhaps tomorrow there are still things to learn." She stood and accompanied them to the door, her face composed but pale. In the stairwell, the concierge lingered again in her doorway, eyes sharp. "Trouble with the Lachaumes?" she asked, too casually. Maigret ignored her, only tipping his hat. Outside, the rain had eased, but the pavements gleamed, and the air carried the sour smell of wet coal smoke. They walked in silence for several streets before Lucas spoke. The wife suspected. That makes her useful. "It makes her human," Maigret replied, "but not guilty." He stopped before a tobacconist's, bought fresh matches, and then turned to Lucas. "We must return to the café. The woman with the umbrella, she did not enter, but she came for him." By the time they reached the café again, afternoon had slipped toward evening. The lamps inside glowed yellow through the misted windows. It was less crowded than the night before, a lull between lunch and supper. Perrin greeted them stiffly, his politeness stretched thin by unease. Julien avoided their eyes, busying himself with spoons and cups. The rear table remained draped, an absence that seemed to draw all eyes even when avoided. Maigret took his usual seat and let the silence stretch until Julien, unable to bear it, came near. "Inspector, may I—" "The woman," Maigret interrupted softly, "with the red umbrella. Did you see her face?" Julien swallowed. Not clearly. She was in the doorway. The light was behind her, but she was not young. He hesitated, then added, "And she wore gloves." Pale gloves. They made her hands stand out against the dark. "Did she speak to the man?" Number only looked. Maigret let the boy go and sat back, his pipe unlit again. The picture sharpened in his mind, a man waiting with his hat, drinking little, glancing toward the door. A woman pausing outside, powdered too soon, gloved hands clutching a bright umbrella, unable to step across the threshold. The silence between them heavier than any words. Lucas leaned close. If she feared to enter, she feared to be seen. "Exactly," Maigret said. He rose, pulling on his coat. "Come, we will walk." They wandered the quarter slowly, Maigret stopping at tobacconists, bakeries, the small shops where local gossip lived. He asked almost nothing directly. Instead, he bought bread, lit his pipe, asked about the weather, and let people volunteer what they would. It was at a flower shop on Rue Saint-Jacques that an old woman arranging wilted carnations said, "A lady with a red umbrella? Of course, she passes often. Madame Besson, she lives near the boulevard, above the laundry. Always rushing, always nervous." Maigret thanked her gravely, and as they stepped out, the drizzle caught the lamplight like beads of glass. "Madame Besson," Lucas repeated. "She will know why she paused," Maigret said. His voice was quiet, almost weary, as though the inevitability of it pressed on him already. And whether she left him dead or only afraid. They walked on, the quarter settling into evening around them, every lighted window another pocket of silence, every passer-by another fragment of the story waiting to be drawn out. The corpse beneath the café's rear table had begun to gather its shadows, and Maigret knew the living would soon start to crumble beneath the weight of what they carried. They did not go at once to Madame Besson. Maigret was not in the habit of rushing toward names too eagerly, as if a doorbell could force truth to arrive faster than it wished. Instead, he let the evening drift, walking the damp pavements with Lucas at his side, pausing under the awnings of bakeries now closing, the scent of warm bread lingering in the air. The drizzle had become a fine, cold mist again, soaking into his hat brim, making every lamp halo in the fog. He stopped often, lit his pipe, and said nothing, as though listening to the stones of the quarter themselves. When at last they turned toward the building above the laundry, the hour was late enough that shutters had been drawn and stairwells smelled of cooked cabbage and damp washing. They found the entrance narrow, the steps worn smooth from years of feet, the walls lined with chipped plaster. A child's voice echoed faintly from one floor, cut short by a mother's scolding. They climbed until they reached the landing indicated by the florist, where a door bore a tarnished brass plate. Besson. Maigret knocked gently. After a pause, the door opened a crack, held by a chain. A woman's face appeared in the dim space, pale, sharp around the cheekbones, eyes wide and cautious. She was in her 40s, perhaps, her hair pinned but loose at the temples. She recognized the uniform bulk of the inspector at once. Her lips tightened, and she shut the door to release the chain before opening it again. "Madame Besson?" Maigret asked. His tone was low, patient. She inclined her head without speaking, stepping aside to let them in. The apartment was small, 2 rooms, warm with the smell of starch from the laundry below. A lamp with a yellow shade cast shadows across a narrow table, and on a chair nearby lay a closed umbrella, red, its wood handle polished from use. Maigret's eyes settled on it, but he did not remark. Instead, he lowered himself heavily into the only armchair, his hat in his hands. Lucas remained standing. "You know why I'm here," Maigret said. Her breath caught faintly, then steadied. She moved toward the table, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Yes. You were at the café." She nodded once. "Quick. I did not enter." "Why not?" Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the shawl. "Because it was foolish of me to go at all. I told myself I should not, but I walked there, and when I saw him, I could not." She lifted her eyes suddenly, defensively. "He was not my husband. Do you understand? I did not betray anyone. I was only—" She faltered, then whispered, "Lonely." Maigret drew on his pipe, though it had gone cold, letting the silence weigh in the room until her shoulders slumped under it. "He had written me letters," she continued softly. "Not many. Short ones. He would not sign them with his name, but I knew it was him. We met once by chance at the grocer's. We spoke. He was kind, respectful, not like others. I am not young, Inspector. I do not expect much. But when a man looks at you as if you still exist—" She broke off, shaking her head. "And last night," Maigret prompted. "He asked me to meet him. He said it was important, but when I reached the door, I saw him sitting there, his hat in his hand, waiting, something in his face." She touched her own cheek lightly, searching for words. It was not right. He looked as though he had already said goodbye to everything. I could not cross the threshold. I turned away. Lucas shifted slightly, his notebook ready, but Maigret made no move to question further. He asked only, "What time did you leave here?" "A little before 10. "And when you returned?" "1:30. I walked aimlessly first, then came back. I did not sleep much." Her voice wavered, and for a moment she seemed about to cry, but instead she set her jaw defiant. "If he is dead, it was not by me." Maigret nodded. "But you know he is dead." Her silence confirmed it more than words. She lowered her head, hands clenched in her lap. He rose slowly, setting his hat back on. "Thank you, madam. We may need to speak again." As they left the building, Lucas muttered, "She's hiding something. She knew before we told her." "She knew when she saw the café this morning," Maigret said calmly. The street speaks. By noon she could not have avoided the rumor if she wished. But she's not hiding the act. She hides only the shame of having cared. They walked back toward the river, the lamps flickering faintly through the mist. Maigret's mind was not on guilt or innocence, but on the image she had given him, the man sitting with his hat in his hand, already resigned. He thought of the bruise behind the ear, the missing papers, the removed ring. A man ready for an end, and yet helped into it by someone else's hand. At the Quai des Orfèvres the following morning, reports waited on his desk. Janvier had visited the shipping firm. Lachaume was indeed an accountant there, known for his precision and discretion, but in recent months he had seemed distracted, less reliable. There were whispers he had been borrowing small sums, though no proof. And one colleague recalled a quarrel, hushed but heated, between Lachaume and a younger man from the office who had since taken leave. Maigret read the words slowly, pipe smoke rising above him. Lucas stood by the window frowning. If he borrowed, perhaps he gambled. Perhaps, Maigret said, or perhaps he borrowed for someone else. He thought of Madame Besson's shawl, the starch-smelling room, the umbrella by the chair. Not a woman of means. They returned to the café in the afternoon, and Maigret chose the rear table deliberately this time. The cloth had been removed, the stain faint now but still visible. He sat with his bulk filling the space, ordered a beer, and said nothing. The customers came and went as always, but more than once eyes flicked toward him, uneasy. At last, Julien approached, towel in hand. "Inspector, people are nervous," he whispered. "Why?" "They say," he swallowed, "they say the man was not killed here, that he was placed here after. But I saw him, Inspector. He sat alive. I saw him breathe." Maigret nodded gravely. "And yet when you turned, he was gone." The boy paled, shifting his feet. "I thought—" "Yes," Maigret said softly. "You thought." He let the word linger, heavy, then looked back at the door. Rain streaked the glass, and outside a woman passed carrying an umbrella, not red, but black. Still the image pressed again. The pause at the door, the powder on the glass, the gloves forgotten. When he rose at last, leaving his beer half drunk, Lucas asked, "And now?" "Now," Maigret said, pulling his coat tight, "we wait for the living to betray themselves. They always do." The mist pressed close around them as they walked. He did not rush. He never did. The truth would come, carried by the silence, by the careless contradictions, by the weight of loneliness heavier than any crimes. The corpse beneath the café's rear table was no longer voiceless. The living were already speaking for him. The drizzle gave way at dawn to a pale, watery light that cast the city in a thin sheen of grey, as if Paris had been scrubbed overnight but never properly dried. Maigret sat heavily at his desk, a half-finished pipe resting cold in the ashtray, rereading Janvier's notes about the quarrel at the shipping firm. The younger colleague's name, André Jousselin, appeared in neat ink on the page. He had taken leave abruptly the week before, citing illness. The timing was curious, but Maigret felt no urgency to pull him in. He knew too well that dragging a man to the office often hardened his lies instead of loosening them. He preferred to wait until the contradictions in a person's life began to undo them from within. He sent Lucas to the firm anyway, to ask quietly about Jousselin, while he himself walked the streets around Rue Monge. He wanted to feel the quarter, not as an inspector, but as a man letting the cobbles and shutters speak. He passed the dairy, the grocer, the tobacconist, each offering fragments of gossip. Everyone knew that a man had been found dead at the café, though the details shifted like smoke. Some said he had collapsed from a heart seizure. Others whispered of money owed. Still others mentioned a woman glimpsed in the rain. Maigret let them speak without interruption, nodding gravely, his heavy presence encouraging words to spill. What mattered was not accuracy, but the patterns of memory. And the pattern was clear. People had noticed Lachaume's distracted air in recent weeks, his pacing walks, his glances toward the door. People always notice more than they admit, though they only give it voice when prompted by tragedy. At noon he returned to the café. Perrin stiffened behind the counter when he entered, but said nothing. Julien avoided his gaze altogether, his nervous energy contained in the quick polishing of glasses that were already clean. Maigret sat at the rear table again, filling the chair that had once held the dead man. He let his elbows rest on the wood, his thick fingers steepled, his gaze wandering from door to window and back again. It was not comfort he sought, but weight, to make his presence so ordinary and immovable that others would betray themselves by reacting to it. Not long after, the door opened and a man entered, shaking his umbrella free of drops. He was in his 30s, thin, with hair combed too precisely and a scarf tied neatly at his throat. His eyes darted toward the rear table, then away, then back again, before settling reluctantly on a seat near the stove. Maigret studied him without appearing to. The man ordered coffee in a low voice, lit a cigarette with a hand that trembled faintly, and unfolded a newspaper he did not read. Maigret took in the polished shoes, the cuff of his trousers damp from the street but neatly pressed. A clerk's shoes, an office man's shoes. Julien delivered the coffee, and the man gave him a curt nod, dismissive. Yet the boy's glance toward Maigret as he retreated was quick, questioning. The inspector tapped his pipe against his palm and leaned back, letting the smoke curl slowly upward. He was not surprised when the man folded his paper again without reading a line and rose, muttering to Perrin about having remembered an appointment. He left as abruptly as he had come, his umbrella still dripping. Maigret remained seated, motionless, until the door closed behind him. Then he called Julien with a tilt of his head. "You know him," he said simply. Julien hesitated, but the silence pressed. "Monsieur Jousselin," he whispered. "He came with Monsieur Lachaume once. Not often, but I remembered. They spoke at this table. Low voices." Maigret nodded and rose, his heavy frame blocking the light for a moment as he buttoned his coat. He stepped into the street just as Lucas approached from the other end, breath quick from walking. "Jousselin," Lucas said. "He hasn't been to the office all week, but the concierge at his lodging swears he goes out each morning with his briefcase, returns each evening, pretending perhaps." "He was here," Maigret said, and together they fell into step, following the faint trail of damp footprints that still glistened along the pavement. They did not hurry. They would find him again soon enough. By late afternoon they had him at the Quai des Orfèvres, not by force, but by inevitability. A polite summons delivered to his lodgings, a reluctance on his face, but no open refusal. He sat now in the chair opposite Maigret, his scarf still neat, his eyes darting. Lucas leaned against the wall, silent, while Maigret filled the room with smoke. "You knew Lachaume," Maigret said at last. "Yes." A pause. "We worked together. You quarreled." The younger man's lips tightened. "People quarrel. It was nothing. Nothing that made you take leave the next day?" Jousselin shifted. "I was ill." Maigret said nothing. He only looked at him, heavy-lidded, patient, the silence thickening until the younger man flushed and looked away. "He accused me of errors in the accounts," Jousselin muttered finally. "He was old-fashioned. He disliked me. That is all." "Errors? Or theft?" Jousselin's head snapped up. "No." The denial came too quickly, too loudly. "No, never that." Maigret studied him for a long moment, then leaned back. "Where were you last night?" "At home." "Alone?" "Yes." The word was clipped, defiant. Maigret let the silence extend again. He did not believe him, but he did not press. The truth would come from another angle. He asked instead, Did you know Madame Besson? The man blinked, startled. Who? You saw her once, at the café door. I did not, he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles pale. I don't know her. Maigret rose slowly, his large frame looming without aggression, only inevitability. He tapped his pipe against the ash-tray. That will be all for now. You may go. Jocelyn looked up sharply, confused. Go? Yes. Maigret's eyes met his. Go back to your lodgings. Return to your briefcase. Sit alone. The walls will speak to you louder than we can. The man hesitated, then gathered his scarf and left quickly, as though fleeing. Lucas looked at Maigret, puzzled. Why let him go? Because he is already breaking, Maigret said softly. He fears her name. He fears the umbrella. He fears more than he can contain. Alone, he will crumble. They always do. That night, Maigret walked home slowly, the streets slick with rain once more. He did not speak of the case to Madame Maigret as they ate their simple supper, but when she asked idly about the weather, he said, There is always a point when the rain seeps in through the cracks, no matter how tightly the shutters are drawn. She looked at him with quiet understanding, poured him another cup of coffee, and said no more. He sat long into the evening, smoking in silence, certain that Jocelyn's cracks had already begun to spread. Somewhere between the red umbrella and the empty rear table lay the truth, and soon it would no longer be possible for anyone to hold it back. The morning came with a dull, colorless sky, and the river moved like a strip of lead under it. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the deputy public prosecutor paced briefly in Maigret's office, speaking of robbery and delays and the necessity of naming a culprit before the week was out. Maigret listened without impatience, his thick hands resting on the blotter, his eyes half-lidded as if sleep still hovered near him. When the man left, the air felt larger again. Janvier appeared in the doorway with a file under his arm and the particular look of someone who had found a piece that might be a corner or might be nothing at all. At the shipping firm, he said, laying papers on the desk. The head accountant, Dupin, a thin man who counts even his words, says Lachaume was precise to a fault. In the last months, he stayed late to straighten petty irregularities. He would not say who made them, but he hinted they belonged to a younger colleague. Small shortages, always covered before the quarter's end. He showed me a ledger with tiny penciled notes in a hand not his own. The initials A.J. appear beside 3 entries. He pretended not to notice them. Maigret drew the file toward him with 2 fingers, as if it might bruise. The thin penciled letters were indeed there. Faint, the line above them erased and rewritten with precision in Lachaume's careful hand. A man who re-walked other people's steps to make their tracks look straight. He closed the file and sat for a time with his pipe unlit, staring at nothing. Shortly before noon, the duty sergeant tapped the door and ushered in a woman who stepped as if the floor might give way. Her shawl was pinned tightly. The starch smell of the laundry seemed to cling to her even hair. Madame Besson stood just inside the threshold and did not move farther. In both hands, she held a small envelope that looked large because of how she held it. I found this under my door, she said, her voice low but clear, forcing itself to be steady. This morning, at dawn, I think. I did not open it. It seemed yours to open. Maigret took it from her without looking at her face, not in discourtesy, but to make the act itself ordinary. The envelope had no writing. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay a plain gold ring. Not new, the inside edge smoothed by years on a finger. He turned it and saw the faint ghost of an inscription, a date long ago. He did not read it aloud. You told no one, he said. She shook her head once. I have few to tell. Did you hear steps? A light tread, she whispered, as if the memory could still hear her. Not the heavy steps of the laundrymen, Careful, then the envelope slid, and the steps withdrew. He nodded and put the ring in his drawer without ceremony. Her eyes followed the motion, then dropped. "It is not mine," she said, and there was pride in the quiet. "No," he answered, "but someone wishes it to be yours." She stood a moment longer, as if waiting for judgment, then turned to go. He called her back, with a soft, "Madame?" And when she faced him, he said only, "Will you be home tonight?" "I am always home," she said, and it was not complaint. It was the shape of her life. When she had gone, Lucas came in with his hat still damp. "Jousselin left his rooms early," he reported. "The concierge says he returned twice before noon, each time for a few minutes only, as if he had forgotten something. He did not take the train. He walked." Lucas set his hat on the radiator and frowned. "He is a restless one." "Restless people carry things from place to place," Maigret murmured. He touched the drawer lightly with the back of his knuckles, as though feeling the weight of the ring through the wood. They ate quickly at the canteen, where the soup was hot and the bread a day old, and the talk circled the case the way pigeons circle a square, without urgency, returning to the same spot. In the afternoon, Maigret walked alone along Rue Saint-Jacques, letting the hours thin themselves. He looked not at faces, but at hands. How they carried umbrellas, how they worried gloves, how they smoothed the creases in a paper. Hands tell more than mouths when shame is near. Toward evening, when the light went thin and the lamps began to flicker, he climbed the narrow stairs above the laundry and knocked at the door with the tarnished plate. Madame Besson let him in without surprise. The red umbrella stood in the corner like a disciplined child. He asked nothing for a while. He sat. She made tea and placed the cups on the table with the cautious care of someone who has dropped things before. The walls were thin. The sounds from the laundry rose like a faint sea. Irons lifted and set down. Water poured, the snap of a sheet shaken out. They shared the small silence as if it were a parcel between them. After some time he said, "Do you have the letters?" She nodded. From a drawer she brought a few envelopes without stamps, the sort slipped under doors. The writing was plain, a hand that had been trained not to show itself. He read little. He did not need the words to guess their content. Courtesy, gratitude, a request to meet without promise. Loneliness written with a careful pen. He noted only one thing. The paper smelled faintly of the same discreet cologne he had found at the collar in the morgue. He returned the letters to her and folded his big hands again. "Do not open your door tonight unless I am outside it," he said gently. She looked at him for a long moment, then lowered her eyes and nodded. He stood in the stairwell with his back against the cool plaster, as patient and immovable as a wardrobe left in a corridor for lack of space. He did not hide. He did not need to. People avoid what they expect. They stumble over what looks like furniture. The hours edged forward. Footsteps went up. Footsteps went down. The laundry quieted. The building settled deeper into its smells. Once the concierge's cat passed, looked at him with contempt, and continued. He filled the stair with the slow, steady smell of his pipe, then let it go out and did not relight it. Some time after 9, steps paused on the landing below and then came up slowly, as if each stair might object. They were not the heavy rhythm of a worker, nor the nervous tripping of a youth. A man in his 30s, careful, uneasy. The shadow appeared first, then the man himself. Scarf neat, collar turned, hat held in one hand because he did not want it to knock against the door he approached. He had an envelope. He crouched, sliding it toward the crack beneath the wood, and his hand lingered there as if the act might be withdrawn by force of will. "Good evening, Monsieur Jousselin," Maigret said, without moving. The man flinched as if touched by a live wire. He did not run. He straightened slowly, his face pale and not young at all. For a second, a long one, he stared at Maigret like a man looking at his own mistake made solid. Then he gave a small, defeated nod "I thought," he began, and stopped. "I thought perhaps the ring might—" He could not finish. He held out the envelope like a schoolboy offering a confiscated object. It contained nothing. He had come to slide an apology he could not name. Maigret did not take it. "Come inside," he said quietly, and knocked on the door. Madame Besson opened it with both hands and stood back, her mouth a thin line that said only that she would endure what had to be endured. They sat around the small table that had seen so few visitors that each chair seemed embarrassed. Jousselin placed his hat carefully on his knees and folded his hands over it, pressing them until the knuckles whitened. He looked from one to the other and then at the teacups, as if the ordinariness of them might offer shelter. "I didn't mean," he said, and again he could not manage the words. "He was going to ruin me." The last two words came out in a short breath, as if they had been waiting a long time at his teeth. At the office, there were misplacements. Not much. Only small things, moved to other lines, to be corrected later when the quarter ended. He gave a short, helpless laugh that did not convince even himself. Later did not come. He wanted to report it. He said he had covered me twice already. He said the third time would be to cover himself. "He asked you to meet him," Maigret said, not as a question. Jousselin nodded. His fingers worried the edge of the hat brim. "He asked me to come at 10 before he spoke to the director in the morning." He sat with his hat in his hand. He was so calm, that calm. He shut his eyes for a moment. I begged him for a week. He shook his head. He said, "We are clerks, André. Clerks stand straight or they are nothing." He said it without malice. He had no malice. That is the worst of it. And then I grasped his sleeve. The man spoke now to the table. "I am not strong. I wanted only to keep him there, to make him listen." He pulled back. He stood and the chair scraped, and his heel caught the other chair leg. He fell, but in falling he struck the edge. Here. He touched his own head behind the ear with a finger that trembled. He breathed once, twice. Then he did not. No one moved for a long time. From the street below, a cart creaked and then was still. The lamp hummed softly, an insect sound that gave the silence a shape. When I understood, Jousselin whispered, "I thought of the police and of the papers and of the wife who would see my name beside his. I thought of—" His eyes flicked to Madame Besson and away, shame making the space between them expand. "I took his wallet, his watch, his ring. I thought if it looked like the kind of thing that happens in a dark corner." He made a vague gesture with his hand, helpless at the ugliness of his own story. "I hid them in my room. The ring burned my pocket all night. This morning I could not bear it. I thought if she had it, it would be like—" He faltered. "I don't know what I thought." "You followed her," Maigret said, "from the café door." Jousselin nodded once, the movement barely there. She stood with the umbrella. He said her name once. Softly. He had not told me. I hated her for an hour, and then I hated myself for hating her. "I'm not a wicked man, Inspector, only—" He opened his hands, empty, only weak. Madame Besson had not spoken. She sat with the same straightness she had offered the day before at her own door. At last she said, not to plead, not to accuse, simply to put a stone among other stones, "He wrote me that he would not come again. He wrote it kindly." Her eyes were dry. I did not enter the café. I did not want to make him ashamed. Jousselin's head dropped further, as if even the rubbery brim of his hat had become too hard to hold. "If he had chosen to live for himself once," he murmured, "I might have been saved. That is a cruel thought. I'm ashamed of it even as I speak it." Maigret rose. His chair made a small sound on the linoleum, a human noise that ended the spell of the words. He put on his hat as though preparing to go into rain that was not in the room. "We will walk now," he said quietly. and there was neither threat nor kindness in it, only the inevitability with which he stood in stairwells and cafes. To Madame Besson, he added, "You will sleep. There is nothing for you but that." On the stairs, Jousselin paused once to place his hand against the wall, as if to make sure it was still there. Outside, the air smelled of coal and wet stone. The street had almost emptied. The lamps were halos in a mist that was not quite rain. They walked side by side, their steps slow, the city's ordinary sounds closing around them again. No one turned to look. At the corner, Jousselin said in a low, flat voice, "If I had not taken the ring, would it have changed anything?" "No," Maigret said. "It would have changed nothing, but you would have slept a little more." They continued without speaking. Somewhere behind them a window closed. Ahead, the Seine lay dark and patient, carrying what it always carried, indifferent to names. The café would open in the morning, and people would sit where there had been a body, and butter would be spread, and cups lifted. The truth had come not with sensation, but with the tiredness that follows too much waiting. It was enough for now. The rest would be paper, stamps, the slow machinery of consequence. And later, perhaps, when it rained again, a woman would pass with a red umbrella and not pause at any door. The night had carried them to the Quai des Orfèvres without words. Jousselin had walked beside Maigret with the quiet gait of a man who no longer argued with himself. In the office, Lucas took down the bare essentials of the confession while Maigret sat with his pipe unlit, letting the smoke that wasn't there fill the room. Jousselin answered softly, almost with relief, as if the act of putting his weakness into words allowed him to breathe more freely. When at last he was led away, he looked not at Maigret but at the corridor floor, and Maigret did not follow him with his eyes. The paperwork began at once. Pages signed, dates written, the tidy lines of bureaucratic consequence gathering around what had begun as a stain on café wood. Janvier spoke with the prosecutor, who seemed gratified, though less by the truth than by the prospect of closure before the newspapers asked too many questions. Maigret left them to it, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he went down the stairs and out into the wet night. Paris was restless in the damp. Street lamps burned with halos, carts clattered on stone, and voices drifted from cafes where the smell of hot wine promised warmth to those who sought it. Maigret walked without aim, his coat heavy with rain, his pipe clamped but unlit. He was not thinking of the file that would be closed, nor of Jousselin, who now sat on a hard bench under watch. His thoughts returned to La Chaume, sitting with his hat in his hand, already resigned. That resignation haunted him more than the clumsy act that had ended his life. It was the resignation of a man who had balanced the columns too long, who had grown tired of correcting what others spoiled. A man who, even in his private longing with Madame Besson, had written kindness instead of passion, farewell instead of promise. When he reached home, Madame Maigret had left a lamp burning and a plate covered on the table. She did not ask at once, but watched him hang his coat and warm his hands at the stove. When he sat and lifted the cover, steam rose from a simple stew. They ate quietly. At last, she said, "The woman, was she kind?" He nodded slowly, spoon heavy in his hand. "She was kind." "And the man?" "He was weary," he said, and then after a pause, "and honest in his way." She did not ask more. She poured him coffee and folded her hands, content to let the silence between them be enough. He smoked afterward, the pipe finally lit, the smell drifting through the apartment. She moved about tidying, the small sounds of domestic order wrapping around the weight of the day. By the time they went to bed, the rain had stopped, though the pavements still glistened like dark mirrors. The following morning, Maigret returned to the café. He wanted to see it once more as it returned to its rhythm, free now of the corpse that had lain beneath its rear table. The place was already busy with students bent over notebooks, clerks with newspapers folded against their elbows, women drinking bowls of coffee before errands. The air smelled of wet wool and tobacco, ordinary, comforting in its way. The rear table was uncovered again, wiped clean, though if one looked closely, the wood still bore the faint irregular shadow of the stain. Perrin greeted him stiffly, with the half-reluctant deference of a man who wanted the police gone from his establishment. Julien hovered nearby, eyes darting. Maigret ordered a beer and sat alone. No one spoke of the dead man. They had already absorbed him into the city's memory, where tragedies become whispers and then dissolve. Yet as he sipped slowly, he noticed that a few eyes, unguarded, still slid toward the rear table as if out of habit. The space a corpse had occupied leaves its mark longer than stains can. Julien came at last, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. "It was true, then," he murmured, leaning closer. "Monsieur Jousselin, I had thought, but I did not know." "You did not need to know," Maigret replied evenly. "It was enough to remember what you saw. The rest was not yours." The boy flushed, both with shame and with relief. He nodded quickly and returned to his work. Maigret remained, his heavy presence filling the corner without effort. He watched the steam fog the windows again, watched the umbrellas bob past outside. He thought of Madame Besson in her small apartment above the laundry, the red umbrella propped quietly in its corner, her shawl smelling of starch. She would live as she had before, folding sheets, boiling water, and carrying the memory of a man who had written kindness in short letters. She would not speak of him again, and yet he would remain with her, not as scandal, but as silence. Toward midday, he finished his beer and stood, placing coins on the table. Perrin gave him a small nod, grateful and wary at once. Outside, the air was sharp with the smell of wet stone. He walked back along the boulevard, his pipe lit, his breath mingling with the smoke. He did not hurry. There was no need. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the file was already being assembled with official phrases and stamped pages. The prosecutor would be satisfied, the newspapers would print a column of half-truths, and the city would turn to its next distraction. Maigret read nothing of it. He signed where required, then closed the folder with a finality that belonged less to justice than to bureaucracy. In the evening, he returned home again to the warm smell of supper and the familiar quiet of his wife's company. He told her nothing more, and she asked nothing more. The case had ended not with revelation, but with the weary collapse of a man cornered by his own frailty. It was not dramatic, not grand, but it was human, and that, Maigret thought as he smoked after dinner, was always the shape of truth. Later, as rain began again in fine, steady lines against the window, he stood for a long while, looking out. The lamps along the street blurred into soft halos, and the city seemed to fold itself back into its grey dampness. Somewhere, another quarrel brewed, another betrayal waited, another resignation took root in an ordinary life. He would wait, and when it surfaced, he would sit silently until it spoke for itself. For now, he let the smoke curl upward and fade, his heavy frame steady in the lamplight, while Paris carried on with its secrets as it always had and always would. The rain persisted through the night, steady but without violence, as though Paris itself had decided to cleanse without ever quite succeeding. By morning, the pavements shone with a slick sheen, and the Seine rolled sluggishly under the bridges. Maigret rose with a weight of fatigue still in his bones, though not the kind sleep could mend. He dressed slowly, pulled on his heavy coat, and left the apartment with his pipe already between his teeth, though unlit. Madame Maigret, watching him from the kitchen, did not ask where he was going. She had lived long enough at his side to know that his steps carried him where unfinished thoughts waited. He returned first to the Quai des Orfèvres. The file on La Chaume sat on his desk, thicker now with neatly typed statements, signatures, and official stamps. It was, in its way, complete. Yet the neatness of the file did not correspond to the raw edges of the case as it lived in his memory. The stain on the café wood, the red umbrella outside the fogged window, the hat cradled in Lachaume's resigned hands. He smoked and read nothing, letting the smoke cloud the pages until they blurred into insignificance. After an hour, he closed the folder with a gesture that was less final than weary. Lucas entered with the easy manner of a man who thought the matter ended. "The prosecutor is pleased," he said, removing his wet hat. "The papers will report it tomorrow. Accountant's misstep leads to death." Something like that. The public will be satisfied. Maigret grunted, neither agreement nor disagreement. He filled his pipe again, tamped it with a thick finger, and struck a match. When the flame steadied, he looked at Lucas through the haze. "Satisfied," he repeated, as though tasting the word, "but not nourished." Lucas tilted his head. "For you, Inspector, there is always more." Maigret did not reply. He rose and took his coat again. "Come," he said simply. "One more walk." They went together back to the quarter. The café had settled fully into its ordinary rhythm now, the chatter rising and falling in comfortable waves, the smell of coffee and damp coats more potent than memory. The rear table was occupied once more. 2 students bent over their notebooks, their elbows brushing the very place where a body had curled unseen. Life had taken back its corner without shame. Maigret stood a moment inside the doorway, letting the sight rest in his mind, then turned and walked out again without ordering. Lucas followed, puzzled but silent. They crossed toward Rue Saint-Jacques, where the laundry's window steamed against the cold. Above it, the narrow stairwell led again to Madame Besson's apartment. She opened at once, as if she had been waiting, though her expression was calm, almost resigned. The red umbrella stood in its place, leaning in the corner like a sentinel. She invited them in with a small nod. "I have nothing more to tell you, Inspector," she said, sitting at the table with her shawl wrapped close. "I know," Maigret replied, lowering himself into the chair opposite. "But I wished to see how you were." She gave a faint, ironic smile. "How does one expect me to be? I wash linen, I iron, I wait. The work does not change." He studied her for a long moment. "You will hear his name in the papers tomorrow, not yours, not even truly his. Only a column for readers to pass over with their coffee." She nodded. "And then it will be finished. For them," Maigret said softly. "Not for you." Her eyes flickered, but did not drop. "I will live," she said simply. "That is all one can do." He accepted this with a small bow of his head. He rose again, his heavy body filling the small space, and looked once more at the umbrella. Then he turned and left without further word. Lucas, waiting on the landing, asked no questions. They walked back toward the Seine. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the streets shining with puddles that mirrored the pale sky. Maigret walked heavily, his pipe smoke trailing behind him, and at last spoke. "Do you know what stays with me, Lucas? Not the quarrel, not the clumsy fall, not the missing papers. It is the quiet." A man sat waiting with his hat in his hand, already finished with himself. He needed only someone else's weakness to complete it. And the city goes on, wiping tables, filling glasses, speaking of shortages and prices. That is what stays. Lucas made a small sound, half agreement, half discomfort. They parted at the quay, Lucas returning to his desk, Maigret climbing the worn stairs once more. In his office, he sat with the file before him but did not open it. He smoked until the room grew thick, then leaned back, his eyes closing. The day ended much as it had begun, with routine. He signed documents, answered perfunctory questions, and gave instructions that required no thought. By evening, when he walked home, Paris had already swallowed the case whole. At the corner near the bookshop, a man argued with a vendor about the price of onions. A girl laughed under an umbrella, not red, but green. The river smelled of damp stone and iron. Life flowed without pause. At home, Madame Maigret served soup and bread, her quiet presence as steady as ever. He told her little, only that it was finished, that the man responsible would stand trial, and that the café had returned to itself. She listened, nodded, and said, "And you, will you return to yourself?" He looked at her with a faint smile, though his eyes were tired. "In time," he said. After supper, he sat at the window, his pipe glowing faintly, and watched the rain return in thin, steady lines. He thought of Lachaume, of Madame Besson, of Jousselin with his scarf too neat and his hands trembling over a hat brim. He thought of the café's rear table, now reclaimed by students and their notebooks. And he thought, as he always did at the end of such cases, that nothing truly ended. The truth had been uncovered, yes, but beneath it lay only the quiet persistence of human weakness. Loneliness, fear, resignation, waiting to surface again elsewhere. He drew deeply on his pipe and exhaled, the smoke curling into the lamplight, and let the silence settle. Paris carried on outside, indifferent, while in the inspector's mind the memory of the corpse beneath the café's rear table remained, not as triumph or a failure, but simply as another small wound in the endless fabric of the city. And he, as always, would be there when the next one opened. The trial of André Jousselin would come soon enough, but by then the matter would already feel distant to those who had lived around it. The café had regained its hum of routine, students laughing too loudly, clerks bent over their newspapers, Perrin polishing glasses as if no stain had ever darkened his table. Even Julien, once so nervously haunted, had learned to carry plates again without glancing at the rear corner. Life in Paris was practiced in its ability to absorb a death, especially one without spectacle. For Madame Lachaume, the loss was sharp but strangely muted. She had known her husband's silences too well to be surprised by the secret loneliness revealed in his letters. She wore black, she answered the necessary questions, and she remained in her apartment with the same heavy clock ticking on the sideboard. Her grief, Maigret thought, was not the grief of sudden violence, but of a resignation that had already existed in her home long before the café closed that night. Madame Besson, above the laundry, kept her shutters half drawn. She said nothing to the neighbors, who gossiped in whispers about her shawl and her umbrella. She returned to her ironing and her folded sheets, and the red umbrella stood untouched in its corner. Maigret visited her once more, only to find her steady, if pale. She had survived worse things than longing, he suspected. She would continue to live quietly, as though her kindness and her silence had become a sort of shield. Jousselin confessed in full, with a relief that astonished those who heard him. There was no malice in him, only the weakness of a man who had hoped to bend small truths until they broke in his hands. His quarrel with Lachaume was never about money alone, but about the shame of being seen, the terror of exposure. He had clung to excuses, but in the end, his own conscience betrayed him before any piece of evidence did. Maigret had only to wait, to let the silence of the café, the ring in the envelope, and the boy's recollections press upon him until he collapsed under the weight of his own story. The newspapers gave it a small column. Tragedy in a quarter café. Clerk's fall exposed. They spoke of embezzlement, of weakness, of an accidental blow, and of justice that would follow. To most readers, it was nothing more than another line of print to be forgotten with the next headline. But for Maigret, the case lingered. He thought of the man beneath the table, his hat in his hand, his body already speaking of farewell before another's hand gave it permanence. He thought of the woman who could not step across the threshold, powdered too early, paralyzed by her own modesty. He thought of the boy with the nervous towel, of the owner with his bolted door, of the city that watched without looking. Each had played their part in the quiet tragedy that unfolded without a cry. On the final evening, after the papers were closed and the last report filed, Maigret walked home slowly, the rain beginning again in thin, insistent lines. He stopped at a café, not the one where the man had died, but another nearby, with fogged windows and the smell of coffee thick in the air. He ordered a beer and sat alone, watching the steam rise from cups, the rain blur the faces outside. Ordinary people, ordinary voices, carrying within them the same small, silent wars. He drank slowly, thinking not of guilt or innocence, but of the fragile balance each life maintained, the ledgers each man and woman kept in their hearts. When he finished, he set down the glass, paid with coins that clinked softly on the counter, and stepped back into the wet Paris night. The case was finished, but not ended. Nothing ever truly ended. The city absorbed it, and life went on, and Maigret walked home through the rain with the quiet knowledge that beneath the calm surface of every café, every boarding house, every narrow street, another story waited, patient, silent, inevitable. And he, pipe in hand, would be there to listen when it rose. 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 Rose.